Good morning.
Good morning.
How many of you in your life have had some sort of a cataclysmic event?
You and Jim and Jeans did.
Something that rocked your world and not necessarily in a good way. Anyone?
Oh, sure.
I've had that happen. I was a rancher. I had a lot of livestock of different kinds. I had a large family, lots of children. They were wonderful, wonderful people. I was well respected in the community where I lived. And all at once, I lost all of that. All my livestock were wiped out. All my kids were wiped out. I went from being at the top of the heap to below the bottom of the barrel. My name is Job. You might know me better as Job, because that's what you call me today. But I want to tell you my story today in my own words. Before I start, you need to know something about me. There was never a time, even when I was a young boy, that I didn't love God, that I didn't think He was there, that I didn't acknowledge Him and see His greatness in everything that I looked at. I grew up loving Him. I prayed to Him. As I got older, I sacrificed to Him. I don't even know why we did that. I guess it was handed down because we didn't have the Word of God in my day. But I loved God. There was never a time I didn't love Him. Even as I went about my day, I would acknowledge Him as I thought about different things and engaged in different activities. I married a wonderful woman. We had 10 children, 7 sons, 3 daughters. Truly, they were wonderful people. They loved spending time together, getting together, and fellowshipping with each other. I was wealthy, and God had blessed everything I had done. I had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke, that would be pairs of oxen, and 500 donkeys. I had servants, workers too numerous to count. I was so well respected in the city square that when I would go to the city square, the older men, the elders, would stand up, defer to me, nod, and put their hands over their mouths. Life was wonderful, but I knew it was all from the hand of God. One day I was sitting at the front of my house, just thinking about things, and in the distance I saw a man coming generally toward me. It's not something I saw every day. As I looked at him and sort of studied him, I realized he was moving as quickly as he could, but he looked worn out, just haggard. In fact, I thought maybe he had a little bit of a limp. As I studied him, I noticed another man coming behind him. It was clear that they weren't together, but the other guy also looked like he was moving as quickly as he could, but he also looked very, very tired. After a little bit, I saw another man coming from my right in my direction, and then a fourth coming from my left. Each of these men looked like they were really hustling. They had a sense of urgency about their gait. Well, I got up and I thought to myself, this probably can't be good. And as I met the first one, I saw in his eyes a mix of anxiety and terror, along with just the tiredness. And he said to me, Master, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing, and the Sabaeans swept in and took them all, and they killed all of the workers except me. I'm the only one who got out to tell you. My first thought in that moment was for those men and their families. I was heartbroken. I didn't have much time to think about it because the guy behind him was on me. I mean, he was there right after the first one had finished his message. And he said to me, the fire from God fell from the sky and hit all of your sheep. They all died. And all of your servants and workers that were attending the sheep have perished except me. I'm the only one who's escaped to tell them. Again, my mind went to those men, the workers and their families. But I also began to realize financially, this is really a big deal. The third one was there right as the second one finished speaking. And he said to me, Master, the Chaldeans swooped in with raiding parties and took all of your camels, and they put everyone to the sword, except me. I'm the only one who got out to tell you. I realized I was financially ruined. My heart still went to all those workers and their families. And when the fourth one got there, right after that, I couldn't imagine. There was nothing else to lose. What possible news could he be bearing to give me that day? And as he approached, I noticed not just terror and angst in his eyes, but anguish. And I couldn't imagine what he was going to tell me. He glanced at me briefly, and then he looked down. He couldn't make eye contact with me. And he said, Master, all of your children, they were all having a party in the house of the oldest one. And a freak wind swooped in and collapsed the house. It caved in on all of them. They were all crushed. Even all the servants were crushed. I was the only one near the door, and I got out, and I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. Well, the first three were bad enough. I knew my life would never be the same after that. But hearing what the fourth messenger said, I knew my life was over. It was effectively over. Everything I had known was over. I didn't have any idea how I would share the news with my wife, who bore all those children. I said to the men, come on up to the house. I was in shock. I got back to the house, I sat down, I tore my clothes, I sprinkled dust on my head, and I wept. But my mouth opened and I said this, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, I'd said, blessed be the name of the Lord many times. If I'm being honest about it, I'm not sure I completely believed it 100% that time. I couldn't imagine how this had happened to me. I'd loved God my entire life. I still did. And yet, here I was. I didn't get a lot of sleep after that, neither did my wife. But one night, I did manage to doze off a little bit. And as I tossed and turned, I realized I was in pain. Every time I turned, I couldn't get comfortable. And as the light rose, the sun rose and the light shone, I could see on my arms and on my legs and on my chest boils, giant watery blisters that were painful everywhere on my body. I could feel them on my face. They were crowding my eyes, making it harder for me to see. And I could not get comfortable. Every time I touched any part of my body, it hurt. I thought, what on earth is happening? Because of all this, I was basically banished from the city. I had to live in the outskirts of town, basically in the dump where people would take their garbage and burn it. I sat in the ashes of everybody's trash. As my body tried to heal and then more boils broke out, my skin turned black and it peeled. It was festering. There were places I could see worms in it. I couldn't eat. I couldn't keep anything down. I didn't have any appetite anyway. So I lost a lot of weight. You could see my shoulders and my hips from outside my skin. I had bone deep, gnawing pain, 24/7. I was unable to sleep. I couldn't get comfortable. On top of that, I stunk. My body reeked as it rotted away while I was still living. My wife, that wonderful woman, someday I'll come back and tell you more about her. My wife, that wonderful woman, attended me through all this, but she couldn't hardly get close to me. My breath was so bad, it made her retch. It made her literally nauseated. But still, she did everything she could. So there I was in the dust, trying to heal, trying to get better. Have you ever had a sore that as it gets better, it itches, but then when you touch it to scratch it, it hurts? Has anyone ever had that?
Yeah.
My whole body was that. And so I found near me some broken pottery. I found a piece that had a very small, very sharp edge to it. And with that edge of that pottery, I tried to work it in and scratch the parts that itched without touching the parts that hurt. That was basically my life. I wanted to die, if I'm being honest about it. Now, for the record, suicide wasn't really a thing in my time. Nobody really thought about taking their own life. But I definitely wanted to die. I wanted to cross the finish line of death and just end all of this. So I was sitting there after months, sitting there in the dust heap, trying to get some comfort, unable to do it. And one day I looked in the distance and I saw 3 men coming. I could barely see them because my eyes were crusted over still, but I could see 3 men coming, and my first thought was, oh no, I'd seen this before. But then I realized there wasn't anything else to lose. There wasn't any possible bad news compared to what I'd already been through. So as they got closer, I noticed they were pretty well dressed and they had pack animals. They'd come from some distance. As they got a little closer yet, I could see on their faces looks of shock and surprise as they saw me. Each of them tore their clothes, sprinkled dust on their heads, and wept loudly. And when I heard their voices, and I really tried to squint and get a good look at them, I realized they were the 3 best friends I'd ever had: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They had come from many, many miles away. I don't know how they organized the trip. They must have sent messengers back and forth. But after all these months, there they were. You have to understand something else. Before they got there, remember in the good old days, I was well respected in the town, in the area where I lived. After all this happened and I was banished to the dust heap, I was the butt of everybody's jokes. Not only was I ostracized and effectively excommunicated from all of the community, the people that were nuts, that were banished from living in the town because they couldn't live with everybody else. They spit on me, kicked me, taunted me, mocked me. That was my life. My wife was the only person I had during that time. These 3 guys came and they tore their clothes and sprinkled dust on their heads and wept loudly. They sat down with me. Those days were very, very dark. I can't imagine any darker days for anybody. And yet the day those 3 friends showed up, and finally there was somebody on my side. There was someone just being there with me, not making fun of me, not spitting on me, not taunting me. I can tell you that was the very best day I'd had in a very, very long time. It wasn't a great day, but it was the best day I'd had of all those really, really awful days. They sat there with me and I watched the sun rise and set 7 times, and none of them said anything to me. They got up and they chatted amongst the 3 of them, and they took food and water, and then they came back and they just sat down. That's all they did. They were just there with me. Well, I didn't know what to say, but it was customary for the aggrieved person to speak first. So I thought about, what on earth could I say? I wanted to die. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, I don't have anything to lose just by being transparent. So I spoke up after 7 days, and I basically said to them, I just want to die. That's what I said. Now, it was more artful than that, and I kind of said it in 3 ways. In your book of Job, has all this in chapter 3. I started by saying, I wish the day I had been conceived never existed. I wish I had never been conceived. I wish I had never began as a single cell in my mother's womb. I wish that day, however God keeps the records of history, could just be expunged, cleared, deleted from the record. Having been conceived, I went on, and I said, I wish I had been stillborn. I wish I had expired before I had been delivered from my mother's womb. I wish that the eyes that were fully formed in my mother's womb had never seen the light of day. Having been conceived and having been born living, I simply went on to wish I could die right then. I wish I could just cross the finish line and end it. As I said these things, I noticed something that really surprised me. My 3 friends, as they listened to what I was saying, their faces changed. The looks of sympathy and comfort vanished, and they began to look surprised. as if they'd been expecting something else. I couldn't imagine what they would expect after what I'd been through. But it was clear that they weren't expecting that. So when I finished, Eliphaz was the first one to stand. And he was very diplomatic as I look back on it now. What he said was, in concept, in principle, you need to understand how this works. And men older than your father and our fathers have understood what we're going to tell you. And here it is. Those who do what is right are blessed, and those who sin are cursed. He didn't really accuse me of anything. He spoke in the third person. He spoke in concept. But I knew exactly what he was saying. He thought I had done something to bring this on. I was shocked. I was saddened. I was disappointed. And I got angry the more I thought about it. He even said, the children of the wicked receive the due penalty for their sin. That really hurt. That really hurt. As I listened to what he was saying, you have to understand something. The three friends were together over here and I'm over here. Well, 90% of communication is not the words that we say. It's our body language and our facial expressions and our tone of voice. And by their body language and expressions, I knew Bildad and Zophar agreed with everything Eliphaz was saying. He was speaking for all three of them. All three of them thought I had done something. I wasted no time. When Eliphaz was finished, I told all three of them what crummy friends I thought they were. When I look back on it now, I'm not proud of everything that I said, but I was a man with nothing to lose. I bared my soul. I said everything that was on my mind. I told them they were like streams that dry up just when you need the water. I'm sure I said a lot more things than that again, I'm not really proud of as I look back on it today. But I couldn't believe these three men thought I had done something. Now, in fairness to them, you need to understand something else. I had the same theology. We all had the same theology. We all believed that those who do what is right would be blessed, and those who sin would be cursed. Now, I'm not saying I was perfect, but I knew I didn't have some catastrophic sin, some deep sin in my life, because our theology was that the punishment would fit the crime. No, none of us, including me, had ever known anyone as cursed as I was at this point. I was living it. But I knew I didn't have some deep sin like that. I thought these three men knew me better than that. I thought they'd come to be with me and comfort me and share my confusion, my bewilderment, and how this could have happened to me. And yet, I realize now the whole time they were sitting there with me for those 7 days, they thought I had done something. Well, again, I wasted no time telling them what terrible friends they were, and then Bildad got up next. Well, he was angrier. And he spoke to me directly and accused me of terrible things. And then it went on and just got worse and worse from there. I rebutted what Bildad had to say, and then Zophar got up and spoke. And he said he was the worst. He was really angry with me. All three of them wanted me to confess what I had done so I could get right with God. I couldn't imagine how they could believe that about me. I thought they knew me. I had nothing to confess, not to that degree, not to that depth. There was nothing. So after I rebutted Zophar, then Eliphaz got up another time, and he spoke. And then Bildad, and then Zophar. I gave my rebuttals to all three of them. The essence each time was them telling me I needed to understand that I was suffering because of some great, deep sin in my life. I just needed to confess it. Well, after that, Eliphaz got up one more time, a third time, and he gave a speech that I rebutted. And then Bildad got up for a third time, but his speech was different. He looked worn out. In fact, all three of them looked worn out by then. And Bildad got up, and basically what he said was, how can a man be pure before God? We can't reason with you. You're impossible. He was right. We were at a complete impasse. They hadn't budged me, and I hadn't budged them. nobody was going to win this argument, and it was just time to give up. So they gave up. They still believed I had done something that was obvious, but they were tired of arguing with me and getting nowhere. Looking back on it now, all three of these friends had done something else in their speeches, which I could hardly hear at the time. But each of them yearned for me to get right with God so that I could be restored. They had no idea that I didn't have something to get right with God about. They had no idea that I didn't have some deep sin. They had arrived, looked at me, assessed the situation, and diagnosed great sin. And the remedy was for me to confess it, to get it on the table, to get right with God so He would restore me. But the thing I love about these men looking back was they yearned for me to get right with God, even though they were completely wrong. They yearned for me to get right with God. That was the deepest yearning of their heart. Like I said, I could hardly hear it then. But when I go back and read what they said now, I understand them so much better. Well, after Bildad gave up on behalf of all of them, I gave another eloquent speech, if I do say so myself. I'm not proud of everything I said in there still, but I gave a few remarks. In fact, if you look at my remarks in chapter 31, verse 3 of what you call the book of Job, you'll see that I packaged all that theology, the same theology, up into one verse. I basically said misfortune is for the wicked. It was right there. I believed the same thing. A younger man got up and spoke then named Elihu. But as he spoke, there was a storm coming in, dark clouds on the horizon. And early on, from quite some distance, we could hear thunder. It was the most magnificent, deep, rumbling thunder I'd ever heard in my life. I don't think any of us had heard anything like it. The lightning as it approached was spectacular. Elihu referred to it several times in his speech as it approached, and when he finished, we heard the voice of God booming out of the thunder in that storm. Now you need to understand something else. As I gave my rebuttals to these friends, and as I just bared my soul during all these speeches, over and over and over again, I yearned for an opportunity to speak with God. I wanted to talk to Him. I thought I could ask Him, why? What happened here? Or maybe He didn't know about it, and I could say to Him, I need to explain this to you so you can fix it, you can make it right. I knew if I appealed to Him, I could win my case. I knew He would listen to me. I knew He'd be gracious. I knew He would set the record straight. I imagined talking to Him as one man would speak to another. Well, as the storm approached and I heard the voice of God, what I heard was, who is this that obscures my path with words but not knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. It's not good when God says that to you. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you will answer me. Then God went on to ask me all kinds of things. Did I know how He created the earth? Of course I didn't. Did I know how He marked off where the water of the ocean could go with the waves and where it had to stop? Of course I had no idea. Did I know where wild animals gave birth in rocky cliffs where no man could really reach anything? Of course I had no idea. When He got halfway through, He said to me, what do you have to say? I said, I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say. In fact, I said, I clapped my hand over my mouth. That's what those elders had done when I went to the city square. They would stand up and clap their hands over my mouth, and now I found myself doing that very same thing. Well, He went on, and He asked me about two huge beasts, the behemoth and the leviathan. He asked me if I thought I could tame one and bring it home as a pet for my kids, or if I could touch one and live. He said, if you ever touch one of these, you'll never forget it and you'll never do it again. I need to explain something else to you. When my soul felt the presence of God, He didn't have to say anything. I knew who He was. I knew in an instant who He was. I knew what He was like. I knew that I knew almost nothing even in that instant. And yet everything I knew about Him told me He was so complex and sophisticated and complicated, so all-knowing, not just mighty, but so almighty, at the same time so loving and so benevolent. I realized in an instant how significant, how enormous, how huge he was. I realized in an instant he didn't have to answer to me at all. He didn't owe me anything. I realized in an instant how insignificant I was, how puny, how tiny to question God. And at the same time, in the same instant, I realized how significant I was. Not because of anything I had done, but because God assigned me that significance. Everything I was came from him. I realized I was nothing without him, and yet there he was, talking to me, setting the record straight. It was he that set the record straight for him, not for me. You have to understand the irony of all this. Over and over, I had wished I could talk to him, to ask him why, ask him to set the record straight. He didn't address any of that. I learned later about the conversation between him and Satan that set all this in motion. He didn't even mention it. He didn't address my suffering. He didn't address what had happened to me. He didn't comment on it at all. He didn't address the theology, the unfairness of it all. He didn't comment on any of that. And yet, even though none of my questions were answered, I had no more questions. I didn't have any questions. I was completely settled about the whole matter, being merely in his presence, without him saying a word. Before he said a word, I knew all that, just from being in his presence. When he finished, he said to me, basically, what do you think? And I said to him, surely I spoke of things too wonderful for me to know. I had heard of you, my ears had heard of you before, but now my eyes have seen you. My eyes hadn't actually seen him, but my soul had been in contact with him. I had known him to the extent that a person can know God and live. So that's what I said. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. You see, I didn't have some great sin to repent of, but I learned in those moments with God and the minutes that followed. Of course I was a sinner. I was so far removed from the holiness and the purity of God. I knew all of that as that transpired, just being in God's presence. And I literally had no more questions. What I want you to understand this morning is what I learned. There is never a time that God cannot be trusted. He is enormous. He is incomprehensibly deep. He is not mighty. He is almighty. He is omnipotent. He is good. He is pure. He is just. And he reaches out and makes contact with us through his Son, Jesus Christ. And by the way, when I gave my speeches, I imagined Jesus Christ. I didn't know his name. I didn't know for sure that he was or wasn't there. Sometimes I wished there was a Redeemer. Sometimes I acknowledged a Redeemer. I was in a little bit of an emotional roller coaster. You'll have to give me a little grace for that. But I wished and I imagined the role of a Redeemer. Now I know who it is, and it's Jesus Christ. And he is God, and he's one with God. What I want you to know is there's never a time he's not there. And in his presence, you can be sure he knows everything. He is just, and he loves you more deeply than you can begin to imagine. Thank you for letting me come and share this morning.
Amen.